Let me touch on the media from a number of points of view. Let me just go over some facts. The first point to understand is if you think that the function of Channel 3 or the Burlington Free Press is to educate you about the world in which you're living, it's not. It really is not. And that's the nature of private media in general. The function of private media is to make money for the people who own the media. It is a business. When you go to McDonald's, you don't go there and say, Jesus, I didn't get the whole story about what's going on in Nicaragua. You got a hamburger. And when you watch television, you also should not be terribly disappointed that you have not learned about what's going on in the world in which you're living. That is not the function of television. In general, not in general, but as is the fact, the mass media in this country is owned by very, very wealthy people.
The FCC voted today to do away with a long-standing set of rules that prevented an individual or company from owning TV stations and newspapers in the same market. The change allows a person or company to own
protesting what they claim is biased coverage from NBC 10's parent company, Sinclair Broadcasting. The protest was organized by a women's activist group called Kent County Huddle. They're concerned about the content airing across Sinclair stations, claiming it has a conservative slant. NBC 10 News Director Scott Isaacs says any commentary...
National attention this week after President Putin unveiled the country's new arsenal of nuclear weapons. The media is now speculating that there'll be a new arms race between Moscow and Washington.
Government, at the direction of Vladimir Putin himself, orchestrated cyber attacks on our nation for the purpose of influencing our election. That is a fact, plain and simple.
So should the public take away a sense of confidence that the Russians have completely stopped, as of November of 2016, trying to interfere or tap into our electoral systems? Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying, sir. I believe the Russians will absolutely continue to try to conduct influence operations in the U.S., which will include cyber intrusion.
Very few people study propaganda or covert political influence operations, and therefore they don't know the history or the techniques by which perceptions management can be accomplished. And so I simply ask, how do you know you are perceiving foreign reality correctly if you don't know how your perceptions could be managed by any number of actors, friends, or foes? I wanted briefly to review a couple of the classic methods of Soviet propaganda and disinformation which have been carried on by the Russians in the modern era. And let me just say, we in the United States, not having collected information on this, nor having studied this in any systematic fashion, have been blissfully unaware about the degree to which this has affected our perceptions. But there are others, for example, in neighboring countries, and not least of which is Ukraine, where people who living there are very familiar with Soviet active measures and now Russian active measures. One of the most essential elements of Russian strategy and Soviet strategy is to define the terms of debate. Any good debater knows that he who defines the terms of debate is halfway towards winning it. And what has the Soviets did this in all sorts of classic fashion. They were for peace, we were for war, they were for disarmament, we were for arms race, they were for security, we were aggressors who were creating insecurity, etc., etc.
And the estimate is that perhaps in 5 years there will be 6 major communications corporations in America who will not only control the newspapers, but also the magazines, also the book publishing firms, also television, also radio. That is frankly very, very frightening.
Does it matter who owns the TV station that delivers your local news? Polls show that many Americans trust local news more than other sources. The largest owner of local stations in the country, Sinclair Broadcasting, is planning a merger that would make them even bigger. It is a move that is raising concerns because of Sinclair's policy of combining news with partisan political opinion. William Brangham has the story.
The country's largest owner of local TV stations, the Sinclair Broadcast Group, reaches over a third of homes across the nation.
Compromise plan for the controversial Kenesha Sin.
Most of us think of local news as just that, local. Stations run local stories produced and reported by local people. But if recently you tuned in to, say, WVTV, which is Sinclair's station in Milwaukee, you saw this.
Does the president have to repeat that fact day in and day out for us to believe it?
That's Boris Epstein, former member of the Trump administration and now chief political analyst for Sinclair. And here he was again on WEAR in Pensacola.
The president stating the fact that the fringes of the left and the right,
and on KSAS in Wichita,
are both capable of hate and violence does not mean he's condoning any of it.
And again on every single one of the 173 Sinclair stations across the country. On those stations, you might also see these.
We should only tear down the bad statues, one viewer told me. But who decides what is bad?
That's Sinclair executive Mark Hyman.
What responsible adult hasn't pointed to a scar as a reminder to not repeat a foolish act from their youth?
Sinclair mandates that these clearly conservative editorials and features get broadcast on every one of their local stations. In some cases, stations have to run them as often as 9 times a week. Eric Lipton is a reporter for the New York Times who's been covering Sinclair.
They have, what they call must runs, which include Boris Epstein, who was a surrogate for Trump, who is, on the air talking about conservative issues. While the local news stations largely decide what their local news is going to be, a covering of local government crime and local issues, there are these must runs that go on their networks across the United States, which have a decidedly conservative flavor.
This partisan tilt has many free speech advocates alarmed because not only does Sinclair own such a large chunk of the marketplace already, but it's hoping to get bigger still. If a proposed $4 billion merger with Tribune Media goes forward, Sinclair would now reach 3 out of 4 American households.
The problem is, there is real power in hearing your trusted local newscasters using FBI and personal vendetta in a sentence.
During his presidential election, he wound up with a record-shattering $750 million in his campaign. To this day, he refuses to report from whence it came. One reason might be that some of it originated from the terrorist group Hamas.
Oh my God! Look, if you are going to make up scary donors to the Obama campaign, why stop with Hamas? Just keep going. He won't say where the money came from. One reason may be that it originated with this gang of coyotes that has made billions selling human babies to other hungrier coyotes.
Former FBI Director James Comey testified before the U.S. Senate on Thursday, and it turned into a major television event, countdown clocks and all. As I've said in my previous commentary, the media coverage of this administration seems to be a lot of hype and very little substance. The media's inaccurate coverage of the Russia investigation. Comey called out the New York Times for inaccurate reporting throughout his testimony. Comey said that the Times story alleging repeated contacts between Trump associates and senior Russian intelligence officials in the year before the election was largely incorrect. Not a good look for the Times or the national media, who repeated this report on their platforms time and time again. In an ironic twist, Comey's memos were leaked to that same publication, the New York Times, he slammed on Thursday. The third point and our bottom line here: no matter how opponents of the president try to spin this, the FBI, under then Director Comey, never investigated the president on this matter. So contrary to widespread expectations, we actually learned much more about the president's opponents and his critics from Comey's testimony than about any issue involving the president himself. There's an unfortunate urgency among some in the media to uncover something, anything, that could hurt the president or those close to him. Flashing breaking news on the screen long after news broke, criticizing the First Lady's shoes, calling the president's children and press secretary names. All of these are examples of members of the news media allowing their career ambitions or political beliefs to slip into their reporting. Many in the media would lead you to believe that the White House is in chaos, America is in a continuing crisis, and the world just may be ending. Be careful to not fall into those traps. Newspapers, cable channels, internet publications, and media personalities are all businesses. The more views and clicks they get, the better it is for business. A lot of that, let's be honest, because the president is not a lifelong politician. He did not have scores of people riding his political coattails like almost every other president in recent history. The White House is a tough place to work. I could tell you firsthand that it is a pressure cooker. Is everything always smooth and perfect in this White House? Of course not. But is it at your job? Just because someone in media says that there's a meltdown in Washington, D.C., does not make that true. As you're taking in news and political coverage, do not buy into the hysteria. Facts show that our country is fine and it is heading in the right direction.